So I just watched They/Them and I want to talk about it because it's almost a good movie. Almost. Sort of. The directorial debut of writer John Logan, whose resume is the epitome of the word varied, having previously wrote some truly excellent bona fide classics like Gladiator, Hugo and Skyfall, but he's also no stranger to a bad day at the writer's desk as he's also wrote some less stellar efforts with lead credits on the likes of Alien Covenant, Star Trek Nemesis and 2002's The Time Machine. Unfortunately, They/Them, despite its fundamentally clever title, falls firmly into the latter group of less impressive outputs. And it's a shame because there's the core of something that could have been really truly special and compelling here. But the film can't help but stack on the flaws as it develops, eventually creating a confused mishmash of ideas that's never quite sure what it wants to be. The potential here is clear from the premise alone. A slasher film following Jordan, a non-binary protagonist, see what they did with the title there, struggling to survive alongside a cast of other LGBTQIA+ youth in the backdrop of the real-life horror of a gay conversion camp is, at least to me, an absolutely knock it out the park level idea if done correctly. The whole thing has so much going for it. Conversion camps are, in actual reality, already fucking nightmare prisons of psychological and often physical torture for young teens and should be exposed as such. And yet, their inclusion as a subject in film is surprisingly minimal and thus far seems to be relegated to either intimate and reflective character dramas like Boy Erased and The Miseducation of Cameron Post, or documentaries on their atrocities, such as This Is What Love in Action Looks Like and Pray Away, with only a single cult satire from 1999 in But I'm a Cheerleader breaking away from that template as far as I can find. Shockingly though, at least up till this point, no horror, at least not any that I can think of, which is weird because the ghastly practices these places take part in are already more horrific than the vast majority of grim terrors depicted on the big screen. The idea of shining a light on their shady practices by drawing parallels between the psychological and physical horror of experiencing a summer stay at one of these wretched venues with the psychological and physical horror of being physically hunted down by a masked serial killer feels... I don't know how to put this other than... right? Yeah, of course a conversion camp should be the setting for a horror film. They're already fucking horrors in their own right. It becomes even more of a seemingly perfect combination when you consider the history and legacy of the horror and slasher genres and their previous flirtations with queerness and gay coding, often at times in an othering sense, but also as well the genre's natural evolution into what's often more thoughtful representation. They/Them had the potential to almost act as a subversive response to the depictions of gayness in slashers like Nightmare on Elm Street 2. Which for those of you that have long watched the channel will remember in my deep dive I mentioned that although it has now come to be reassessed and celebrated in certain queer communities, it had initially been written by its creator's own admission as a homophobic rather than homoerotic movie, aiming to cash in on the gay panic of the time. And hell, They/Them summer camp setting has a long legacy in the slasher genre thanks to the huge impact of the Friday the 13th franchise and its many imitators. One of the more popular of which this movie even feels like it could be a direct response to, as by depicting non-dangerous, gender non-conforming and trans characters in this setting and in a protagonistic and heroic role, it almost feels like an intentional subversion of the trans panic revelations of the cult classic Sleepaway Camp. And on top of that, because of the way horror as a genre has developed over time, intentionally or unintentionally, as one of the more welcoming to all the gays and the theys of the world, They/Them also seemed like a natural fit to slot in right beside its contemporaries, with films and shows like the recently released Hypochondriac, Fear Street, Jennifer's Body, or the new Chucky series. Horror has embraced queerness in a way a lot of genres haven't, in a kind of non-corporate way, where these stories aren't told in such a method that they can be edited out subplots to appeal to overseas markets with strict restrictions on visual representations of gay characters and acts. So conceptually here, we have a LGBTQIA+ horror movie written by a gay man that pays homage and responds to the legacy of horror's past, meets the kind of new wave gay movements of horror's present, and all the while doing so in a setting that is both rife with material for the genre, as well as gives the film a social conscience in using the medium to explore and expose the shitty practices of one of modern society's ongoing evils. As an idea, as just a concept, this film is rich with possibility. Thematically speaking, there's so much potential here. Hell, it seems to me that it's such a shockingly good hook that I can't fathom fathom how it hasn't been considered and done before. And the only explanation I could suggest to offer up is perhaps producers thinking the world wasn't quote-unquote ready, whatever that means, for this kind of diverse, mainstream, queer-centralized horror story. But recent successes have proven audiences are definitely ready now, and thus the world can have this film and all of the incredible possibilities it could represent. With all of these ingredients in place, it should be a recipe for success. So why is it kinda bad then? Well, to put it simply, it's just not a very good slasher movie, and in trying to be one, it only succeeds in pulling focus away from the real psychological horror at its core, which often makes up for the rare instances where the movie shines. And it's a shame because when it's good, it can be kinda great. It's just that greatness actually ends up making up very little of the movie's runtime. Everything starts extremely promising too. The film opens on the genuinely somewhat tense stalking and murder of an unknown character in a dark forest, giving us the promise of a slashy good time, before dropping us off with the other main source of horror in the movie as our main cast of teens arrive at the camp to meet their counselors, including the camp's leader, Owen Whistler, a villainous high point of the movie played to perfection by Kevin Bacon. The thing that makes this opening so strong is the particular way in which the filmmakers have chosen to present the camp counselors, particularly captured through Bacon's excellent leading performance. Instead of being immediately hit over the head with the kind of gay-bashing, God-loving sermons a place like this would be stereotypically known for, the counselors seem understanding, empathetic, perhaps even kind? They perfectly capture this kind of unsettling facade of face value pleasantries in a way that's almost reminiscent of the Jesse Owens idolizing, wish they could have voted for Obama 3 times white rich family of Jordan Peele's Get Out. And this to me is way more sinister than the transparently aggressive alternative. It's more underhanded, more manipulative, more calculated, and as a result, far more dangerous. It's a near perfect depiction of the way actual bigots use these optics to appear reasonable, to make their opponents, the people their ideology would oppress, seem like the wildly uncooperative and unaccommodating ones. It's a shockingly common tactic used by figureheads within poisonous movements. Walk out into town and in front of cameras covered in hate slogans a la Westboro Baptist Church, and you'll be met mostly with derision. But take a person with extreme views and stick him in a suit and a smile, and well, let's just say Richard Spencer was a thing for a while, wasn't he? These camps do this all the time too. It's not psychological torture, it's reparative therapy. This would already be a good direction to take the antagonistic forces in, but examining this closer, there's also a lot of subtleties to Bacon's performance and dialogue that secretly betray the true nature already bubbling below the surface. When he introduces the camp, he says lines like, "This isn't about making anyone less gay or more straight," a line which is kind of interesting when you consider it's framed as the only 2 valid options. Like, he doesn't say less gay or more gay, it's less gay or more straight, which phonetically to your ears kind of sounds like 2 contrasting choices, but in actuality, that's kind of the same thing. In other instances, the character will often do something like get a camper's pronouns wrong, only for another camper to correct him. He'll then chuckle kindly and say something like, "Yes, sorry, my bad," again giving the pretense of acceptance. But those paying attention will notice that although he may apologise, he never then goes on to correct himself, instead changing the topic or focus of conversation. It's a characterisation that sticks throughout the whole scene as Kevin Bacon delivers a warm, grinning monologue about how their camp is different, how he respects all sexualities and gender identities, and how God loves them all the same, and how that'll be the last time he brings up the man upstairs. And this characterisation, to the film's credit, stays consistent for most of the film, making the rare moments of great horror where this facade breaks and the camp staff's intentions are truly revealed hit that much harder. In a later scene, and real high point of horror in the movie, in order to reinforce gender stereotypes into the teens, Whistler takes all of the quote-unquote boys group to go shooting, and I use boys in quotation marks there as this is what Whistler defines as the boys' cabin, when in actuality the group also includes a non-binary teen and a trans woman Whistler has just lumped in with them. At first, despite the moment being still somewhat underlined with a kind of conservative and unpleasant approach to masculinity, the teens actually manage to have fun with this activity as protagonist Jordan gets a chance to outgun the toxic alpha male male-type counselor forcing the task upon them, while the rest of their friends cheer them on. But it quickly descends into chaos when one of the teens is asked to do something cruel and unusual under threat of violence, while Whistler quite literally screams slurs and obscenities at him only inches from the poor kid's face, in a manner that is both shockingly mask-off for the homophobic camp leader, yet still somehow aligns perfectly with the image of that uncomfortable, warm smile we met him with. And listen, if the film was just that, just this constant back and forth of these evil people juggling this pretensive goodness with their actual wicked intentions, while a group of really likeable LGBTQIA+ teens walked on eggshells around them and tried their best to survive and escape this whole harrowing ordeal without extreme psychological or physical damage or even death, then this film would probably be a hell of a horror movie. I know I've already made the comparison to Get Out earlier, but it really could have been something along that kind of wavelength. Unfortunately though, while all this stuff is, for the most part, well handled, it's also only like a third of the movie. Let's not forget it's also a slasher film, and to be quite honest, it's also kind of a coming-of-age teen drama too. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing. If they interwove all this together, it could still make for a riveting, engaging, and even hard-hitting movie, but instead of feeling like connective tissues, these three genres almost feel like three separate jigsaw puzzles. The pieces don't go together, they're all just jumbled up in the same box for some reason, and when you finish building all three separate pictures, instead of seeing some kind of revelation that totally justifies their grouping, you kind of just end up scratching your head wondering why they were all lumped together to begin with, especially when the confusion that came from sorting out the pieces diminishes the enjoyment of solving any one of the puzzles individually. It could have worked, sure. The coming of age stuff, for example, totally makes sense as an ingredient in a story centered around a large cast of teenagers with confusing feelings around their sexuality and gender, mingling with others who are more defined in theirs, all while under the guardianship of authority figures who insist they have to behave and act a certain way. I mean, any narrative where confused teens are the heroes against adult authoritarians practically has coming of age written in its DNA. However, the delivery of this stuff in They/Them definitely falls a bit into, shall we say, Disney territory. I mean, there's even a musical sing-along segment where all the teens get together and reassure one another by putting on a full impromptu motivational performance of the song Perfect by Pink. And look, I think the scene is fine in isolation. I've seen some reactions to this section of the movie in particular that I'd personally say have been pretty harsh. Mostly I think it's because it commits the cardinal internet sin of being cringe, and yeah, it's very Glee, it's very High School Musical, and the song choice could certainly have been better and less on the nose and fluffy, but there's nothing inherently wrong with a cheesy musical pick-me-up in the middle of your teen movie. But the problem is, this isn't a fun teen movie. This is a horror movie, specifically one on the very real horror of conversion therapy. And on that note, I do very much get why this scene has been so thoroughly rinsed. In isolation, it's maybe a little twee and sickly sweet, but mostly harmless. In context though, it comes immediately after protagonist Jordan has just had a one-to-one meeting with the camp's psychologist, in which, through smiling teeth, she tore Jordan apart bit by bit, telling them they're disgusting and not special, breaking them away until Jordan is left crying and uncertain in their camp bed. And like, I don't know, maybe a choreographed musical number is not the thing that should immediately follow something like that. Don't get me wrong, I don't believe the film should be without joy, not at all. I think watching likeable gay teens struggle in this environment till they die or go home broken would be an absolutely laborious watch, and the film definitely needs some kind of humanity and hope to grab onto, rather than being just nearly 2 hours of trauma porn. But there's a line to walk, you know? Maybe the joy could have simply been the friendships and camaraderie formed at the camp from the teens looking out for each other. You know, maybe we could have found a level of joy that sits somewhere between psychological torture and musical numbers. Maybe it didn't have to be quite that extreme a jump. It just feels a bit weird that our protagonist more or less literally dances their troubles away when their troubles are, the threat and delivery of severe mental and physical abuse at the hands of bigots. And let's not forget, somewhere in amongst all this mess of clashing tones, we still somehow have to fit a slasher movie in there. Although if you did forget, I wouldn't worry too much, because it often feels like the filmmakers forget this too. This movie, which was primarily marketed on being a slasher, goes for long stretches of time without being a slasher at all. To the point that when a hooded figure very occasionally does pop up for some spooky stalky hijinks, it's always suddenly jarring, and you're like, yeah, that's a thing too, I guess. Besides the very opening, the kills feel randomly interspersed, rushed, wholly without tension, and almost completely disjointed from the rest of the narrative until they suddenly loop back into relevance in the film's final act. And again, look, like I've already said, drawing parallels with actual horror genres and the real horror of this setting could be really clever if done right. But, and this is probably the film's worst aspect, it turns out that this is not even remotely what they are attempting to do here. I'm getting into spoiler territory at this point, so I'll try and phrase things in a way that doesn't spell out everything too explicitly, but just be aware I am going to talk about the ending of the film. So if that's something you don't want to hear about, I'm letting you know that this is your out now. So I've already established the film has a host of problems for me, but for my money, this is absolutely its worst quality. And that's coming from me, who loves this subgenre so much that for the entirety of last year's October, I essentially became that daily slasher video guy. I am perhaps more forgiving and more willing to seek out the positive aspects of the often maligned genre more than most, and this was definitely the aspect of they/them that I was most excited about, as no doubt many of its audience were, since this was the aspect of the film that was most heavily marketed. It's even in the title after all. But you see, not only does the slasher stuff not really fit in with the rest of the film for most of its runtime, not only is it kind of poorly executed, lacking in any tension or punch, not only does it not even have the turn your brain off popcorn entertainment gore factor of creative kills, but it also does absolutely nothing for the film. In fact, it doesn't just not add to it, its inclusion actively strips away at the potential thematic richness and any clever metaphor depicting some level of parity between this fictional horror and the real life horror of its setting is inherently torn apart by certain plot developments. Not to mention, as you work out what's actually going on in the film, which is pretty clear early on, the way the narrative goes minimizes all stakes and tension that could have ever been in the film to begin with. And let me explain why that is. You see, the thing is, the first person to die in this film after the scene-setting opening is a lecherous, gross caretaker who, among other things, watches the girl's cabin undress on secret security cameras without their consent. And that's pretty normal for a slasher movie. There's always an awful character, civilian as they may be, that tends to bite the dust at the hands of big stabby baddie. But then the next to die is also one of the camp staff. And then so is the fourth person. And when you remember that the individual killed before the opening credits was an adult woman, you start to put two and two together and realize something. The teens, the heroes you are rooting for, they aren't under any threat whatsoever from this killer. The killer only seems to be going after the camp workers. And sure enough, a final act reveal does in fact show that actually the killer was only after the camp staff and our young heroes were never in fact in any danger. At least not from the slasher component of this narrative. And that is bizarre. I get not wanting to kill any of the teen characters because they're all essentially likable gay kids being forced into an already traumatic situation, and watching them systematically be picked off one by one is not exactly fun and would potentially dip its toes into the exploitative trauma porn water. Personally, I do not want to particularly see a movie that sounds quite so nihilistic, not even in a horror film, but to literally have them be under no threat whatsoever completely undermines any level of potential tension. You can't have them almost get away because there's nothing to get away from. You can't have that moment where the killer closes in because there's no killer closing in on them. What we have, it turns out, is just a masked vigilante murdering all the bad people around the teens, which also, essentially solves the main narrative conflicts for our protagonists for them. They're not proactive protagonists, but even if they weren't, the plot of this movie plays out essentially the same. They don't have to actually rise to any challenge and better the camp staff or escape the campgrounds because, well, that's all being taken care of for them. And then as far as the kills themselves go, I've already said they're executed without any real narrative tension, but that is doubly true when literally every time the killer makes an appearance, it's in the vicinity of someone you're quite happy for them to kill. Am I supposed to worry for their safety? Am I supposed to hope they get away? Because, nah, bollocks to them. I'm rooting for the killer here. These people are, to put it in quite simple terms, literally the bad guys. I'm hardly scared that the murderer might get the result that I'm actually hoping for. And don't get me wrong, a lot of older slasher films have this problem. The later Friday the 13th titles are notorious for creating civilian cannon fodder so unfathomably unlikable that the audiences often root for their demise. But they at least know what they're doing there. They're hokey and fun and entertaining in different ways, not meant to be taken completely seriously, and Jason is the main draw of those movies at that point. But They Slash Them is really trying to do something. It feels like it really wants to make a point, like it wants you to think about the horror of it all, both real and fictional, and yet its ending reveal feels like a total cop-out. One that you see coming from so early on as to strip any pretense of danger, actively removes narrative hurdles for the heroes you're rooting for, and functions seemingly as a way to make sure none of the main good uns have to kick the bucket, and that all of them can get a big hallmark happy ending where they sit around in their coming of age growth and envision the possible future to come. Which, by the way, also feels like a massive cop-out. Again, I don't think the film should be joyless, but to put such a Disney self-acceptance happy message on the end where all the teenagers survive and come to terms with themselves feels, I don't know, kinda tactless considering the subject matter. I don't think the real kids who have to suffer these awful places get to have a happy hallmark ending where everything works out. Again, I must state, I don't think the film 100% needs to have this horrible grimdark conclusion where everybody dies or suffers. It should have a happy hopeful ending in some ways. Just maybe not one so happy that it feels like it should be wrapped up in a lovely little bow, if you get me. And that's They Slash Them, a prototypical example of how a great concept does not inherently make a great movie, and how the execution of a great concept is just as important as the concept itself. There's certainly stuff to love here. When it looks at the real horrors of conversion camps, it feels like it's really onto something, and the cast top to bottom pretty much all knock it out the park. Plus, it's great to see genuine representation across the board here, especially in a story like this with LGBTQIA+ themes so central to the narrative. However, all those good decisions and all that potential couldn't save it from being a weird mishmash of ideas that never quite works. It's a Frankenstein's monster of concepts, but none of those parts are its legs. I wouldn't say I liked it, but on the other hand, because of its good parts and because of how interestingly it doesn't fit together, I wouldn't say I had a bad time with it either. I'd go so far as to say I'd even recommend it, though it's a pretty damning recommendation in that I would suggest watching it not for the movie that it is, but to better imagine the movie it could have been. Though if nothing else, we all must admit that it has an absolutely banger title. Hey y'all, so just before I sign off for the day, I want to give you all a quick update, and I'm afraid it's actually kind of bad news. Sorry if this is a downer to end a new video on, but I didn't want to open with this and kill the vibe, and I couldn't think of anywhere else to put it other than in a community post, which I know a lot of you won't see because of the way YouTube pushes content. So basically, I don't really know how to say this, and this is probably a bit of an overshare here, so if that's something that's going to make you uncomfortable, feel free to close the video now, I guess. But this year has just absolutely kicked my ass. Like, it has been soul destroying and one of the single worst and most devastating periods of my life. I ended this year coming off the back of my first Christmas without my granddad after his sudden loss, and then when determined to get back on the horse, each month only introduced more awfulness as I walked headfirst into a severe bout of COVID, job and financial uncertainty, had a very public and embarrassing breakdown at my day job, to be honest with you, which was then followed by my poor girlfriend breaking her ankle so severely in 2 places that 3 months later she still isn't healing and might need to go for surgery. And worst of all, I very recently had another family tragedy so awful and sudden and under such traumatic circumstances that I currently can't bring myself to talk about it here, as I can feel myself getting upset just thinking about it. But anyone who follows me on Twitter or checks out my YouTube community tab will know exactly what I'm talking about. Apologies for bringing this up at all, but I do so for 2 reasons. I want to say that because of all this going on, among many other crappy things, I'm mentally very, very drained right now, and I hope you can forgive me that my output has been, and to be honest, will be continuing to lack as of late. I know I've promised my patrons a big pitch video a while back that still hasn't surfaced, and honestly, a huge part of that is because the script I wrote for it deals mainly with the theme of grief, and I just do not remotely have the energy to deliver that right now. On top of that, I'm just finding it generally really really, really hard to focus and write and get passionate about things, which is why I've done a video just now on the likely very algorithm unfriendly small horror release of They/Them that probably no one will see, rather than the hot topic at the moment of something like Prey or Bullet Train or something more engaging like one of the video essays I have rattling around as an idea in a notebook somewhere, all of which I probably do have a lot to say about if I really thought on it, but I just find the act of actually engaging with those right now really exhausting, and I'm just having to go with whatever my brain finds the easiest to discuss in the moment if I want to make anything at all. And I don't know why, but for some reason it happened to gravitate towards talking on this movie right now, and even this was a real struggle to write, taking me well over a week and multiple attempts to put it together before we even get to editing, which I'll definitely be paying my mate Jamie to do on this one, as I just simply don't have the mental fortitude right now to deal with that. I don't know what rhythm future uploads are going to follow or what things they're going to focus on. It might be stuff you guys want me to talk about, it might not be. I can unfortunately say with no degree of uncertainty that there will definitely be no wholesome Halloween this year. I know that was always up in the air after what I said in the last 2021 episode anyway, though as time went on from that episode, I had considered one last effort this year and even started planning it, but to attempt to pull it off in my current state would just be genuinely unhealthy for me right now. I'm really sorry about that. I hope with all things considered right now, you'll forgive me for being a bit scattered, both in upload schedule and in terms of the potential randomness of content that does come. I'm just going to do what I feel I can, and I really do not know at what level or quality or subject that will be at. To quote the great Satoru Iwata, please understand. Secondly, and probably more importantly, and thankfully a bit less of a downer, I wanted to give a very vocal thank you to everyone who donated to my dad's memorial fund after I posted it on Twitter and my YouTube community tab. I started a campaign to try and raise 150 quid for MS Society UK in his memory, which is a cause that was close to his heart due to friendships he had in life, and we raised over 10 times as much, with 230 supplied at the donation box at the funeral and the rest all raised online. So if you were one of the people that donated or reached out with your condolences in any way, just thank you. Seriously, thank you so much. I cannot overstate how much that means to me. Your generosity has been an absolute beacon of light for myself and my family in one of our darkest times. And just thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Anyway, I'm going to dip now. I'm not going to do any Patreon shout outs as it feels a little weird to do them after that. But if you are a patron, thanks for your patience with all this, and I appreciate your continued support. And just so you're aware, I know I forgot to do Patreon shout outs for the last couple of vids, but I've remembered now and I'll get back onto them starting with the next videos whenever they may be. Sorry that wasn't a more fun and exciting update, but I just wanted to be totally clear with you all, especially since some of you are paying me, just so if you weren't aware of my current circumstances, you at least had some explanation of my seemingly lackadaisical approach to YouTube right now and for the foreseeable future. Appreciate you all. Thanks again, and I'll see you next video.